Greetings, everybody. I'm Jim Umhoefer, the president of the Sinclair Lewis Foundation. Our goal today is to talk about three important things that are coming up regarding Sinclair Lewis. One is the Sinclair Lewis Writers Conference. We've got the Writers Conference speakers that were scheduled to be in Sauk Center this fall, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are postponing that till next year. They have each graciously agreed to join us next year, as Don Shelby says, if the creek don't rise. So we're hoping for that, and we'll give everybody a chance to talk about their presentation for the Writers Conference. Then we're going to mention the historic presentation called The Life and Loves of Sinclair Lewis, which was scheduled at the American History Theater in St. Paul this fall. That's been postponed until July of 2021. Don Shelby's part of that, as well as Jim Gambone and Bob Beverage. They will talk about that a little bit. Our third topic is a new biography of Sinclair Lewis, published by the Sinclair Lewis Foundation. We call ourselves Free Air Press, after one of Lewis's books. We'll mention that. Our goal today is, like I say, to promote these initiatives. First, about the Sinclair Lewis Foundation. Our mission is very simple. We exist to perpetuate and celebrate the memory and works of Sinclair Lewis and to continue his legacy of mentoring writers. So in that, we are both an historic organization as well as an arts organization. So with that background, we'll jump into the Sinclair Lewis Writers Conference. 1990 was our first conference. So this year is our 30th anniversary. Of course, we'll celebrate that next year on October 2nd, 2021. Don, I want to start with you as a keynote speaker. Please introduce yourself and what you're going to be speaking about.
My name's Don Shelby. I thank you very much, Jim, for asking us back again this coming year. It's an important conference, and it's attended by a lot of very, very interesting people, writers and aspiring writers, aficionados, people who love the stories. And I thought that I would try to do my best in bringing Sinclair Lewis into the modern day. We've got so many things to concern ourselves with right now. It's taking up most of our brain space, most of our bandwidth, just dealing with the issues of the day, from racial justice to COVID-19 to climate change, and on and on and on. They just keep stacking up. And so we need to find a space in our brain that can relate to something that is not, let me use the word evil, it's not something that is depressing constantly. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is using my experience, the 60 years in journalism that I have had, to try to bring Sinclair Lewis into the modern age, to show that he is relevant. This comes out of a conversation with both Jims, Jim Umhoefer and Jim Gambone. Jim Gambone, if you're from the old country. That question was, is he being read today as much as he was read at one point? Is he becoming passé? Has he gone the way of other writers? Is there some obscurity beginning to surround him? And how do we bring him back in the modern age? And the truth is, and I will show you some interesting things here. Those are first edition Sinclair Lewis's, and that's Aerosmith and Elver Gantry and Dodsworth and Main Street and Babbitt. And just a reading of these alone, and using the application that a journalist would use of relevancy, and whether it's on topic, that, and it can't happen here, and a number of other important works that he wrote about, shows that he was a very modern person. Even though Main Street is pictured as a quaint and sometimes a throwback to an older time. Actually, all of the issues are relevant today. And some of the, not just the issues and the mores are relevant today, but the specific incidents that he has to face and his characters have to face are extremely important. And so I'm talking about the title, playing around with the title. We've got a year, but playing around with the title called Sinclair Lewis in a Changing World. And did the world change that much from the Sinclair, the world Sinclair Lewis knew? As you know, I did a Mark Twain thing, and Mark Twain spent a lot of time and wrote a book, in fact, with Charles Dudley Warner called The Golden Age. And if you read that book, it is a template for today. It is the exact thing that is happening today. And so I wanted to bring more relevancy to the writing of Sinclair Lewis by using a journalistic perspective to say he wasn't talking about old-fashioned things. He's talking about things that are relevant and immediate to our consciousness today. So, Jim, that's what I'm planning on talking about, but I am happy to take any direction or any guidance from any of you on the call today on how I could sharpen that, change it, redirect it. I'd be happy to do whatever you wish to do.
Thank you, Don. Of course, he's relevant in many ways. In fact, this decade, one of the reasons that we are doing this is because in 1920, of course, is when Sinclair Lewis wrote Main Street. And during the 1920s, his 5 big novels that culminated in 1930 being the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Main Street, Babbitt, Dodsworth, Arrowsmith, Elmer Gantry, all trend-setting, all in Lewis's way, shining an uncompromising light on how he thought things could be better. So through this decade, 2020 to 2030, we have the centennial of each of these major novels. And we are hoping with this historic production and through the Writers' Conference, the new biography to help promote Lewis. There was a op-ed piece in the Los Angeles Times, and I believe in the Journal of American Medical Association, about the relevance of Arrowsmith. They concluded that in 1925, Lewis wrote about a pandemic, and people should be reading him today, the same issues. So that's our goal. And Don, we're glad that you're part of that. And over the year, of course, things can be tweaked, but that sounds like a great start.
Hey, Don, this is Jim Gambone. You probably know this, or we probably talked about this in the past, but from my little bit of research into Sinclair Lewis, with all of his books, with all of the books that he wrote, he always had a section in each one of the books where he outlined how he could make things better. And I tried to find, for example, the section in Main Street. I couldn't find it. That there was a whole, I think there was 120 some pages or something. It was a large number of pages that the editors always cut out of his books because they said it didn't fit into the story, it didn't help to build the characters, it didn't help to build the novel. But it was another sign that he wasn't just writing as a modern writer, but he was really trying to make things better in the communities and about the issues that he wrote about. So that's just a little piece too that I think made him more interesting for me, was the fact that he wasn't just being a novelist, but he was also trying to be a person of his time and trying to change his time. So that was just a little piece that I thought might be helpful.
Thank you.
Well, getting into the heritage of the Writers' Conference a little bit, I want to turn to Freya and Thomas. Freya, as I'd like to mention, in 1990, your dad was the very first keynote speaker, Frederick Manfred. And you've been a speaker at the Writers' Conference several times, and Thomas, you've been a speaker at the Writers' Conference as well as Don. So I want to turn over to you right now to introduce yourselves, talk a little about what your topic would be we're going to ask you to co-present next year. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
You want to go first? Yeah, you go. Freya's going first.
Well, we might go back and forth since I tend to interrupt a lot. I just wanted to mention, apropos of what Don is going to be talking about, I think it's it sounds like really a great beginning and middle and end, maybe even. But I wanted to mention that it's appropriate, the way you're putting it, that it's a template for today, the Aerosmith, for example, by Sinclair Lewis. And I just recently dug up my father's second novel of the 22-some that he wrote. It's called Boy Almighty, and it is set in Minnesota at the Glen Lake Sanatorium, where my father lived for 2 years while he was recovering from tuberculosis, which, as you know, tuberculosis still kills 1.5 million people a year. And this book, Boy Almighty, is about surviving tuberculosis. It is, and it's full of relevant, important things to know. How the way he couldn't get up out of bed for almost 2 years. His roommates couldn't get up for 4 years and 6 years. All his roommates died but one. And it's just a stunning book, and he somehow survived. It ends at Eden Prairie with him walking up a hill, finally able to walk up a hill. And it's also the story of his love life with he met my mother at the Sand. She also had TB. So I brought that up because coming up next May
University of Nebraska.
at the University of Nebraska Press. And he loved Sinclair Lewis. As you know, he was very close. He felt that Sinclair Lewis was his mentor. So it might be interesting if I could find things that he wrote about Sinclair Lewis that might show the relevance in a changing world.
He was the speaker at Lewis's funeral, for example.
Yeah, so you already know that, Jim. So I just want to bring that up about what Don is doing. And then as far as what I'm doing, I've also spent 60 years already loving and learning and writing poetry. And I write fiction, but nobody's accepted it yet. So and also write two memoirs. So I want to speak when I meet the people that come to these sessions. I want to speak with some sort of passion about my passion, which is poetry. I want to talk in particular with them about how poetry looks for and finds the truth, how it looks for and finds the truth. And it can do that sometimes by making us laugh. This session will be about humor and honesty in poetry writing. And I've myself always tried to write honestly as a poet. If I write a poem that isn't true, at least as far as I can ascertain what true is, it upsets me. So I always try very hard to be true. But I have never, ever tried to be humorous, which is kind of interesting in my whole career. But other people say that my poems make them laugh. You know, I've been told that by a number of people, even by the great novelist Philip Roth, who said I was one of the few poets that made him laugh, and by Carol Bly, who's now passed away, this wonderful Minnesota writer, who said that my work was funny. And I was trying to think, well, how come I never started out trying to be funny? Why was it a little bit funny? And I think I think that the humor came out of the honesty somehow. And there was an actor, Gene Wilder, whom you probably all remember, and he was asked for advice on how should I be funny, Gene, in a movie. That as another actor asked him that, and he said, "Don't try to make it funny, make it real. Just make it real." And so I'm going to talk about that with the people
and read some poems.
And I'll read some poems, yes. And if I'll try to get them to jot down some of their ideas for people. Sometimes say that they get writer's block, or they're afraid of writing, or that whatever, that they can't write as well as they want. And I don't believe in writer's block. I think that you should just try to write something no matter what, is in your mind, even if it's really horrible, lower your standards. And that's not even my idea. That's William Stafford, another poet, said that to me. Lower your standards if you're having trouble writing, and stop whining, as my dad would say, and just write. If you have feelings, you can write. And success as a writer, I think, lies in the wisdom of feeling, the wisdom of letting the feelings emerge. That'll start you towards success as a writer. By success, I mean that you finally get out there what you're trying to say, not that you've got $1 million necessarily. So anyway, that's my thing.
Nice. Okay.
Sorry.
So wonderful poems by my dear wife Freya, and a lovely commentary. She's magnetic. You guys are gonna love it.
No, I'm not.
See, I'm her biggest. I get 10%.
Yeah.
Are there any questions before I go on? Okay. Listen, I'm Tom Pope, but before I jump in, Don, you and I don't know each other. We've never met, but I must say I'm very touched by seeing your face there, because you're the only guy I know who has hair as long as mine. I'm very impressed, Don. Yeah, you see, I've been letting mine go too, you see? So things are gonna work out just fine. I'm Tom Pope. I have spoken before at the wonderful conference here, and I'm looking forward to it very much. My background is primarily as a screenwriter. I worked in Hollywood for 25 years, worked for a lot of guys. And since then, I've been for 20 years a teacher at Minneapolis College of Art and Design. But in my spare time, what I think a lot about is what makes a story work. Inevitably, as a screenwriter, storytelling is central. And so that's where I should be thinking more about politics. I should be thinking more about, I think about how stories work, and it fits very well into this wonderful conference. I'm developing a new idea about storytelling. I think almost a revolutionary idea, and it comes from an unusual source. In 1859, Charles Darwin really created a revolution with beginning with the idea of evolution. And since then, some of the greatest minds in science have been devoted to trying to figure out all of the different mechanisms that make evolution work. And it's gotten way more complicated than where Darwin was. And particularly in the last 20, 30 years, it's really even, if anything, picked up the pace. The question of evolution. And you're wondering, what the hell am I talking about? I'm talking about evolution. But I'm finding that, to my surprise, that some of the three of the most preeminent new theories about evolution are, ironically and surprisingly to me, fitting into how stories work. That, you know, the story of evolution is actually the story of storytelling, a story of our lives. So I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation, lots of fun pictures, and you'll have a great time watching it, which I call, you're gonna love this, I call it The Red Queen, the Court Jester, and the Sudden Jump. Because the Red Queen, the Court Jester, and the Sudden Jump are three primary new theories for evolution, which seem to conflict with each other. I won't go into all the details about it, except I'll go into one just so you know what the hell I'm talking about. In Alice in Wonderland, you may remember that when Alice goes down into Wonderland, she meets the Red Queen. And when she meets her, the Red Queen is constantly running around, and Alice is trying to catch up and keep up with the Red Queen. Alice says, she doesn't say, what the hell are you doing? But that's pretty much what she's asking. And the Red Queen says, sometimes we have to run just as fast as we can just to stay in place. And we all feel that in our own lives, don't we? Well, I'm running as fast as I can and I'm getting nowhere. The Red Queen and that statement by the Red Queen has been transposed into an entire theory of evolution, where species themselves are running as fast as they can just to stay even with the competition. For example, the reason why antelopes are so fast at running is that the lions starting faster than the antelope. So the antelopes had to evolve to be faster runners to keep up with the lions that were also evolving into faster runners. And so both species, just the antelopes to survive, the lions to get a meal, both evolved into faster and faster runners.
We kind of lost Tom, but I want to share a little bit of trivia story here about Freya's dad, Frederick. When he was in Sauk Center in January of 1951, Sinclair Lewis died in Rome, was cremated, asked to be shipped and buried in Sauk Center. So Frederick Manfred gave eulogy. He was standing behind the family at Greenwood Cemetery, a mile east of Sauk Center, when they were dumping Sinclair Lewis's ashes into the grave. The myth is that a prairie wind blew his ashes west over the town. More scientific-minded people said, well, that was just the air temperature being cold and the ashes being warm. Frederick, her dad said, well, they tried to bring Sinclair Lewis back to Sauk Center, but he still got away from them. So lots of little trivia here about Sinclair Lewis. And as you get into the biography, it's fascinating to me about as many Sinclair Lewis stories. Ashley, I want to turn to you if we can. Thank you for agreeing to speak at the Writers' Conference. And I know I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us why you don't like the term climate fiction.
Okay. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I know my dad's been part of it for a long time, and I think I even attended one time as a guest of his when I was like 12 or 13, and I remember that to this day. So it's very cool to be part of it myself now as a writer. I am a writer, former environmental journalist. I write fiction now, and I'm the author of a work of narrative history called Red River Rising: The Anatomy of a Flood and the Survival of an American City, which was about the catastrophic flooding in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997, which at the time, and it almost seems quaint now, was a $5 billion disaster, and it was the most expensive disaster in US history at that time. Of course, that just seems very ridiculous at this point when we look at the other disasters that have unfolded since then. And then I am the author of a novel called South Pole Station and a novelette called Muri, which is a climate fiction, if we're going to use that term, and we can get into that later, retelling of Melville's Benito Sereno, and very weird and not like my other work at all. So my own work has been evolving in ways that I didn't expect, speaking of evolution. And I want to talk about that a little bit in my panel presentation, which will be about climate fiction. Right now I've titled it, it's a pretty generic term, but climate fiction, writing our impacted world. I don't like using the term changing world, because our world has always been changing. But to me, climate change is about impact and results of what we've done to the world and the world's response to that great hurt that we have inflicted upon it. So in talking about writing that world, I think I want to focus on sort of the act of witnessing and how important our testimony will be. And I think that ties into Lewis's work in an interesting way. And I'll try to make all these threads come together in that, you know, the idea of writers as a presence, as witnesses to times of upheaval. And so when I look at Lewis's work, I see that in the same way that I see that in Orwell's nonfiction, and in his fiction, of course, too. That idea of how do we as writers make sense of what's happening around us. And not just politically, obviously climate change is political, it's social, it's environmental, it's everything. But I'm interested in the idea of helping people and maybe isolate their very complex feelings about what's happening to their world. How the familiar is shifting into the unfamiliar, how the contours of the seasons are changing, how farmers are struggling, their neighbors are struggling, and making sense of that, obviously, scientifically. But more important to me is how do we make sense of that emotionally? How do we retain optimism and hope? while also being documentary in how we talk about it, not pretending that it's not as bad as it is. That's something I struggle with in my work all the time. So I'm expecting that the people who will be at this presentation are writers, and people who are interested in obviously not just fiction, but nonfiction. And if you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing memoir even, this is going to come into play, whether explicitly or not, because this is our world. When I have talked about the term climate fiction, one of my objections is that it puts that type of writing in a category, whereas I actually think that it is changing into realistic fiction, you know, the fiction of our time. When people talk about writing their experiences or writing about characters who are living in our world, it's not speculative. It can be speculative, it can be dystopic, but if you're talking about what's happening right now as we are on the border of this great upheaval, that's just fiction. That's realistic, contemporary fiction. And so one of my objections to the term climate fiction, which was coined by a journalist named Dan Bloom, I think maybe in the late 70s, is that it kind of shuffles it into a genre. And I don't want it to be a genre myself, because I think it encompasses so much more than that. It can be, like I said, it can be speculative, so it can be part of a sci-fi approach, but I think it's going to become more mainstream. And I think if we take that label off of it, we get more readers. And of course, as a writer who likes to write about current issues and my world and the things that concern me, I want more readers. You know, so I don't want somebody to say, hey, I don't read sci-fi, so I'm not going to read cli-fi. So that's also something I'd like to talk about. But I think for the people who are going to be at the conference, I want to talk about their own practice as writers. I have found that when I go talk about my books, the conversation always becomes about writing itself, because people who come to book readings, they're writers. So I love talking about that. And I want to have kind of an interactive conversation with the people at the conference or at my presentation about how are you approaching your writing and the things that you care about as you also grapple with all the changes that are taking place around you. And I'm not even just talking about what's on CNN, what's on the news. I'm talking about what's happening in your backyard. What are you noticing? Have you seen changes in the birds coming to your feeder? Are you noticing that the leaves are changing earlier? Are you noticing that, you know, if you're in rural Minnesota, that your neighbors are struggling more than they have before? That to me is something that'd be interesting to discuss in terms of tying it back to the act of witnessing and documenting as writers and as artists. So I'm sorry, that was very wordy. You can see what my fault as a writer is. That's why I like delete half of my books before I get to the second draft. But like my dad said, I'm also very open to any suggestions for shaping this.
Ashley, I'm excited to hear your presentation. It's timely and it's relevant. And I think you are spot on in talking about the process and the task of writing. Your audience will be, of course, they're interested in writing. Some have had published works. Most are novices, and they are interested in learning, you know, how does a person become a professional writer in that particular area. So yeah, they want to know about the task. Right. And you can have some writing exercises, and of course that'll increase their interest when you talk about their own process.
Right. Okay. That's a good idea.
And we'll have a lot of time to chat about that, but the purpose today is to throw out some lure and some bait for people
yeah.
In terms of this conference. Our goal today is we'll post this on YouTube, and then Matt is going to make a 3 to 5 minute snippet for social media, and we'll put that on our webpage and on Facebook and try to get this out here. We're going to increase our audience a little bit, and as well as having the physical conference next year, we will have a virtual conference as well. And we're for the first time. So we're looking for a bigger audience.
That sounds great.
Bob and Jim, I want to turn to you. I'll let you introduce yourself, but you'll be co-presenting. Tell us about that, and then when that part is done about your presentation, we'll segue into the historical presentation.
I'll let Bob go first.
See, I was going to let you go first.
I got there first.
That's why we're such good at collaborating. See. I'm Bob Beverage, and I'm a playwright and a writer. I sort of have specialized, not necessarily intentionally, more by default, in writing plays about historical topics and historical people. And Jim, my producer, as I call him, Mr. Producer, found me, and we talked about this project, writing a play about or a presentation about Sinclair Lewis that Don is going to be a key part of. So I guess that's an introduction to me. Mr. Producer, you want to talk?
I'm Jim Gambone, and I've been working in the media field for a long time in various parts of the media field: film, television, theater, satellite productions, and been a writer, producer, director, and sometimes even tried my hand at talent, although that's a real down on the on the lowest part of the scale of my experiences. I'm also a teacher. I'm a public health professor that I teach part-time public health at Capella University. So I work online all the time, and I've done that for 10 years at Capella, and met Jim, and I've known Don for a long time from his work at WCCO as being an investigative reporter, being on one of the leaders of the I team and the founder of the I team at CCO. So I've known Don for a long time. And when I was thinking about doing something in 2016 around the election that was happening, the midterm elections in 2018, the midterm elections, I remembered Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can Happen Here, and a friend of mine from Duluth said, you should read that again. So I read it, and I thought that would be a good thing to do to remind people about the importance of Sinclair Lewis and what he was talking about with the book, It Can Happen Here. And I called Don up and I asked him if he would be willing to be a lead role in a reading that I would do by recreating the Berkeley version of It Can Happen Here, the play that they did at Berkeley, the Berkeley Repertoire Theater, and Don did that. And through that, I got to meet Jim Umhoefer from the Sinclair Lewis, Umhoefer from the Sinclair Lewis Foundation. I always say Umhoefer. I don't know why, but I always say that. And after that production, Jim asked me if I would be interested in doing something around the 100th anniversary of Sinclair Lewis, and that's how I met. And we decided to try to lift up a presentation that would be get some really good visibility both in Minnesota but also nationally and perhaps internationally. And that's how I came in contact with Bob, and the two of us have been collaborating and working for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, on this production. And that's enough of an introduction for myself.
So one of the things that we, when it came to this opportunity to have a workshop at the conference, unlike I think a lot of the other, many other art forms, one of the things about theater and film is that it's a tremendously collaborative art form. As a playwright, you can write as many plays as you want, but if you want to get it produced, you've got to work with a producer or a theater or someone who's putting up the money, because it's not inexpensive, and it becomes a very collaborative art. And I think that's something that's a little different than for most writers, because when you're writing, if you're writing poetry, if you're writing prose, if you're writing, you're the writer, you're the artist. You create the thing, and then there are people out there who will take it and do it. A little different with theater and with film. And so that collaboration, the collaboration, but also the conflict between the producer and the artist, the writer. Not that producers can't be artists themselves, and they are. Jim certainly is. It becomes that's how you get stuff produced. If you want to see your work in theater on stage, you've got to know how to work with the producer. And so we thought that would be a good thing to explore in a workshop.
And one of the things that we've talked about in terms of the workshop that we're going to do is to help guide people through that process. If you're interested in seeing your work produced, for example, there'll be people coming to the writers' conference who may be interested in trying their hand at screenwriting or or being a playwright and writing in that form. And so we want to show them how we've worked by telling our story. And it's been a really good story because the good thing about the two of us is we both know each other's areas pretty well. And that's an important thing to start off with, is you have to really listen and understand understand the other person's perspective, where the writer is coming from, what's important to the writer, what are the themes that the writer really wants to talk about. And then you as the producer also the writer has to understand your perspective. You have a limited amount of time, you have a limited amount of budget. And in this particular case, Bob even had a tougher road to hoe, because the idea was that in writing this historical presentation, we were dictated by the guidelines for the funding of the presentation, that the presentation had to be historically and literarily accurate, which meant we couldn't be making stuff up. We couldn't be creating stuff. And I told this to Bob, and I could just, over the phone, I could just see his face going, "Oh my God, what a horrible set of restrictions for me as a writer." I don't know, Bob, do you want to comment on that?
Well, it's if you are writing about historical subjects, you automatically, that territory comes with the requirement that you are authentic, that you tell the truth, as we were hearing earlier. What was trickier about this was that there was also an emphasis on using the actual words that were said. Mm-hmm. That gave me pause, because at that point I didn't know, how much access will I have to their actual words. And so in this case, it turned out well. I had a ton of access, but those are the kinds of things that the producer has a requirement, that the writer has to understand. And it's not that the producer is being a jerk. It's very real. It's very important. And so Jim's point about, you got to understand each other's roles and be willing to help out in each other's roles. And Ashley's idea about, who's going to want to come to this workshop, I would say anybody that wants to write a play, write a film script, adapt some of their own material to a play. Whether they're creating something original or they're creating something, some type of adaptation of an existing work. I think they might want to come to this workshop and hear about that relationship between the writer and the producer.
Well, again, that sounds like a fun workshop, and I know that both of you have spent time in Sauk Center. Bob, you and I spent time in the Lewis Boyd home, and in terms of the extreme of research, we walked to the Lewis grave site in a downpour.
We did.
just to spend time standing at Lewis's grave and his family's grave. So I appreciate, because I'm part of this with the funding aspect, knowing the collaboration it's very exciting to see the interdependency and how this is coming together. So with that, could you tell us a little bit about the life and loves of Sinclair Lewis, the fruits of this collaboration? What is it about, and when's it going to be, and where?
I'm going to make Jim start this time.
Okay. So we had a task ahead of us. We started out with a really nice process by talking about what are the major themes that we wanted to communicate. What we ultimately came down to with this play, and it goes back to what Don had said earlier about his presentation. I think this is going to be really nice and wrap full center when we talk about this, and that is that the idea, the most important idea is Sinclair Lewis really relevant today? And why is Sinclair Lewis relevant? What makes him relevant? What makes his work and his words powerful today? And what we were able to, and if we're successful, and I think we will be in terms of the actual production, we will be able to show an audience in a variety of different areas, ranging from the pandemic to the rise of authoritarianism, the inclination towards moving towards an authoritarian society around not only here but around the world, looking at provincialism and how people need to expand their ways of thinking about things to accept new ideas. All of those things Sinclair Lewis talked about in his works, and I think our production will show how that, in a dramatic way, will show that, and also bringing in his two wives, I think is really a kind of a cool thing to use in this production. Nobody's ever done this before. It's a really innovative approach to looking at Sinclair Lewis, having those commentaries from two very powerful women that influenced Sinclair Lewis's life in different ways. And so that's how we approached the topic. And then it's Bob's job as the writer to take all of this and make it work as a playwright, to make it work as a production. And then it's going to be Don's job and the other actors that will be in this to bring these words to life and to bring them to an audience in a way that the audience becomes engaged. And if the audience leaves the theater saying, you know, I think I want to read one of those books, then I think we've been successful. And then that goes back to the original thing that Jim had talked about, and that is, what is the purpose of the foundation? The purpose of the foundation is to maintain and promote the writings of Sinclair Lewis. And that's sort of the underlying assumption that I've worked at as a producer in approaching this as a producer, is to make sure that when people leave that production that we're going to show on July 15th through the 18th in 2021, that they leave understanding that Sinclair Lewis is relevant, and that, hey, I want to read one of those books. So
talk a little bit about where the production is going to be and the timeline for that, please.
The production will be at the History Theater in St. Paul. It will be premiering July 15th, which is my birthday, by the way. So it's a wonderful
Was
date.
that an accident?
No, it was an accident, complete accident, because I had no control over that. That's Karen's decision at the History Theater, and it will be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday will be four productions, and Sundays will be a matinee. The rest of them will be evening productions. And the good news is, even if COVID is still around and it's bothering us in a way that an audience might not come, we have the ability, and I'm pursuing this and looking and talking with Karen and Ron Peluso at History Theater about even doing this outdoors, so we can do it in the History Plaza. And we're talking about that. We're not quite sure yet. But the nice thing about doing it in the summer as opposed to doing it at the end of October, we can actually consider that as being a possibility. So that's the when and the where.
And Jim, you had talked about down the road about taking this on the road around Minnesota and some other places.
Well, we're looking at putting together a traveling show, and it would be shorter than the one that we're doing, the 80-minute, but would be traveling to 6 cities across Minnesota and including Sauk Center, to put the production on and conduct that with a discussion about Main Street and where is Main Street in these 6 small towns around Minnesota 100 years after Sinclair Lewis wrote his book. So we have all the elements together for a grant, and the Commonweal Theater in Lanesboro would be the theater that would be touring the play around the 6 cities in the state. That would be in 2022.
Thank you. And Don, any comments, perspective from you about the life and loves of Sinclair Lewis?
Well, the only real comment I have to make is that I'm playing myself in the play, and it's quite a stretch.
Doing a brilliant job. You're doing a brilliant job. Couldn't ask for anybody better.
We did cast, however, and we tried a number of people, and none of them turned out, so we came back to you.
They couldn't quite get Don Shelby.
They couldn't quite get Don Shelby.
You weren't supposed to tell him that. I wasn't supposed to know that part.
Well, a lot of exciting things happening, and I want to mention again, this new biography, Magic, is published by Freya Press. Actually, Jim Gambone's wife, Wendy Johnson, through Elder Eye Design, is the one, the company that helped put this together. This is a 12-year process, 10 years by Dave Simpkins, local newspaper publisher, friend of Richard Lingeman, Lewis biographer, and several Lewis scholars from around the country. Dave Simpkins, a small town guy, said, how did it happen that this doctor's son from a prairie village in central Minnesota became a world famous author? So Dave is asking a different question than Mark Shore and Richard Lingeman did in their famous biographies of Lewis. How did Harry Lewis become Sinclair Lewis is really what the question is asking. Different segments of his life, growing up in Sauk Centre, going off to college, working on cattle boats, traveling, working with the suffrage movement from 1919. Lewis called himself a suffragette. He carried signs and demonstrated in New York for the women to get the right to vote. All these elements that came into becoming Sinclair Lewis up to the point of the publishing of Main Street. That's the narrative arc. Boy at Home in Sauk Centre, publication of Main Street. So Dave worked on this for 10 years, died 2 years ago unexpectedly at the young age of 70. He and I were good friends. I worked with him quite a bit on the book. We had canoed and biked and spent a lot of time around Minnesota outdoors, sharing our projects. So I volunteered to pick up the baton and see this through. So the book is a collaborative effort, you can see, with Sally Perry from the Sinclair Lewis Society, as well as myself. I wrote the first chapter that Dave didn't do. Sally wrote the last chapter. Richard Lingman wrote the foreword. A lot of photographs in the book. It's going to fit well with this whole decade of the 2020 with all these centennials. Thank you, Matt. So this book will be available to order through Amazon after Labor Day, Becoming Sinclair Lewis. It will, of course, be available to sell a hard copy at the Writers' Conference at the Life and Loves of Sinclair Lewis. Another pitch for the Writers' Conference, Saturday, October 2nd, 2021, in Sauk Centre. Even if the creek rises, we will be here. Also, to kick up our heels, we have Stevie Ray's comedy troupe will be in Sauk Centre the evening after the Writers' Conference on Saturday evening, October 2nd. Dan Chouinard, performer recommended by Kevin Kling, will be here to lead us in a sing-along. So that will be in the evening on Saturday, October 2nd. Friday evening, October 1st, will be our third annual Cocktails and Conversation. We've covered, first year we covered It Can't Happen Here. And then we've got split people up in the tables, guided questions, beverages are served, conversation loosens up as people enjoy the beverages and each other's company. We come back together at the end. Last year we covered Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse-Five, on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Slaughterhouse-Five. This year, or excuse me, 2021, Friday night, October 1st, eve of the conference. We'll be covering Main Street. Everybody's welcome. I'm going to try to wrap this up. If there's any other comments about your presentation, the conference, anything else?
I want to say how much the becoming Sinclair Lewis, I was really fortunate in having a look at some of the early drafts of the different chapters, and it's, all the reading that I've done about Sinclair Lewis, the book was fabulous, and the attention to detail, and it's so readable. You know, it's really fascinating. So I highly recommend it.
It's an inspiring story. Dave befriended all these people, but he was also scattered by his own admission. He would put quotation marks at the beginning of a passage and forget to put them at the end. So when we got his manuscript, he had 10 chapters plotted out, 8 done to various degrees, first and last chapter unwritten. We asked Sally Perry, and she collected her brain trust. Lewis scholars from around the country would pore over Dave's manuscript, put the quotation marks where they belong, cite the sources. So now we have a book that is a scholarly book, as well as taking a look at the personal story of how did this young boy become Sinclair Lewis. When I think of the amount of time that they put into this, including Sister Mara Faulkner, a friend of Dave's who taught English at St. John's and St. Benedict's, she would turn Dave the journalist into Dave the author. She would say things like, Dave, you got to kill some of your little darlings here. It might be interesting, but it doesn't fit. So she was unimpressed with his work. Every editor needs to be unimpressed with the work that you're looking at. And it helped make this book a strong book. We're very excited. Thanks all of you. Any last comments?
My last comment is I'm sad that I'm going to be in a workshop and not able to attend the other workshops. So that's, I would love to attend Ashley's workshop, and I would love to attend the other workshops that are going on. So I hope there's some way of getting some, if it's going to be virtual and being recorded, then we'll be able to see them, which is great. Thank you for attempting to do that. So
yes, they will be recorded and they will be available. So, well, thank you so much.